perceive others. Psychologization of society means that psychology penetrates into all spheres of human existence. And this is the way we start to understand who we are. When we think about ourselves, when we think about others, we use psychological terms like someone is narcissistic or someone is toxic. It's not necessarily scientific psychology, but it might be pop psychology. And this is the point of reference, psychology as a dominant point of reference in our thinking, comprehension of ourselves and comprehension of human relationship. It wasn't like that before. People didn't perceive themselves in terms of psychology. They did it in terms of maybe morality, maybe religion, but it wasn't psychology. And this means that psychology has become an authority that dictates who are psychologically healthy people. And since psychologically healthy is the main point, the main ideal for us, this means that it is up to psychology now to define what is the ideal human, what is the human who human ideal, the way they're supposed to be. Not only human, but also relationship between humans. Because now when we form a relationship with someone, it kind of feels that there is psychologist who is observing us. This instance of authority, who up to whom is to judge, are those relationships proper? Are they healthy? Are they good? We, even if we don't go to psychologists, we don't go to counselors, we act like there is a counselor who is observing us. It used to be God, it used to be church doing that. People were thinking whether they are sinful or not sinful, are they going to heaven or to hell? Now there is psychologist, invisible psychologist, imaginary friend psychologist, or real psychologist, right? If you have enough money. So this is how we form relationship, how we understand ourselves, is if our life is, the way of life is a proper, correct way of life, or are we living a good life? And it even goes without saying, it's normal for us. It's something we don't doubt. Maybe it's a good thing that we don't doubt it, but on the other hand, it's quite dangerous because it is up to psychology to define what our life is supposed to look like and what our relationship with other people is supposed to look like. We think that they know, and it's quite dangerous if someone knows what to do. The first researcher who came up with the idea of therapeutic society or therapeutic turn in society, this term belongs to him, is Frdric Foucault. He was talking in his book of 1966 about the therapeutic turn, mentioning Freud at that time, who replaced psychology with a religion. Psychoanalysis was the first instance that started to replace psychology with psychological view with a religious view. It used to be psychological perspective. It used to be dominance of religious perspective. And starting with Freud, starting with the rise of psychoanalysis and of psychological practice, it changed into the psychotherapeutic worldview or therapeutic society. According to Philip Reeve, for religious men, the previous type of human, the main goal was to be saved. The main goal was salvation, meaning moral salvation, meaning cleaning yourself from sins and being moral, behaving in a properly moral way, and living in such a way that you will be saved. For this new type of human, psychological human, the goal is different goal. Reeve defines it as a goal to be pleased. He wants to be pleased, meaning he doesn't want to be saved anymore. We don't believe in transcendental values anymore. Morality doesn't mean that much for us. for secular humans, but what means for us is how we feel inside, how we feel psychologically. We are concentrating on ourselves, our mental states, because of the fall of transcendental values and religious perspective, and because of secularization. For Philippe Rive, this is the moral decline of, he criticizes it. This is the moral decline of humanity. And he implies probably, not probably, but sometimes openly that something went wrong. That before people were directed outwards to some transcendental values, to great deeds, to the outside world. They wanted to do something great. They wanted to be heroes. They wanted to be moral. And now suddenly they're directed inwards on how they feel, on whether they have mental suffering. And this is what mostly bothers those new type of people, psychological humans. But in this way, Rive is conservative, because this implies that it was better before, that people before were better people than people now. The problem with this before is that religious perspective with all its morality comes with its terrible sides, like patriarchy and other kinds of oppression. So it's doubtful. This criticism, of course, is important, but also the fact that he criticizes it, implying that it was better before, is quite questionable. But he was the first one, his intuition was the first intuition to see this new type of humanity, new type of society that is directed not outwards, but inwards on how we feel. And for this kind of human, new type of human, psychoanalysis first, and then other types of psychology become the instance of authority. Someone who guides contemporary humanity, contemporary type of human, instead of previous type of human that is religious man or religious or moral human. Yeah, so this is my PhD advisor. What is this type of ideal human that psychology promotes? And what is the ideal type of human that psychology wants to see, and what it implies? According to Zupancic, it's the biomorality, the way she calls it, quite biomorality is quite Foucauldian term. This present type of morality that we have, the biomorality, it's not the traditional morality anymore. It promotes a human who is not suffering, human who is happy, human who is psychologically healthy, meaning happy, meaning deprived of emotional suffering. She claims that this repressive biomorality promotes the axiom that person who is happy is a good person, and person who is sad is a bad person, the anti-hero. And she calls it our own gulag, because this is what we demand from ourselves. We impose on ourselves this ideal, psychological ideal of healthy, psychologically healthy person who's supposed to be happy, deprived of emotional suffering, and it causes us more troubles and more pain when we don't coincide with this ideal. Because life is tough, we are not always happy. Plus, if we have this ideal of healthy, good person that we have to be, we feel even worse when we are unhappy because we don't coincide with this ideal. And this is how we are our own gulag. There is also, so when for Rive, he sees the difference between, and he opposes the religious type of human to the psychological type of human. He kind of tries to see what's the difference, what changed. But we might also say that not much has changed, that within this psychological perspective, we still see the old perspective of psychology. What changed is that it started to be secular. It's still salvation that we want, but this salvation has changed, and the way, like, idea of salvation has changed, and the way we try to attain this salvation has changed. If before Christian believed that we need to be saved from sin and suffering, and sin was associated with suffering, now modern human are in need of liberation from negative aspects of worldly existence. So we still want to be saved, but not for afterlife. We're not going to heaven, but what we try to attain, the mostly goal of our life, is to attain this state of emotional bliss, where we establish our individual well-being. And this is kind of happy ending of our individual personal life. And if we start to think about what we want from our life, this is what we mostly will imagine: our own life and our own well-being, instead of, like it was before, imagining that we are not sinful anymore and we are going to heaven or somewhere. But the idea is still very similar. There's still this separation of hell and heaven. Hell is something that's not supposed to exist, that we need to escape. And the idealized idea of heaven, something good, something where we won't suffer anymore, like in afterlife, just in already in this life, we want to stop suffering and think that it's possible. There are lots of problems with this perspective, with this psychological perspective, authority of psychology, and promotion of psychological promotion of well-being, of absence of suffering, stigmatization of suffering. I taught course on this, but to summarize, we can rely on Heinrich book, where she claims she mentions some of the problem. For example, that why not to reach out to others and support others, and instead of that concentrating of how we feel, working on ourselves, trying to be more psychologically healthy, less stressed, instead of, so why do we concentrate on ourselves, on our own feelings, how we feel, while at the same time we can support others and just suffer, but maybe for a good reason? This is the quite a good question. The other thing, she claims that this imposition of positive thinking, same like Zupančić with the idea of self-gulag. She claims that, for example, for a cancer patient, the demand to be happy and to take it easy and to stay positive might be, and their failure to think positively might be quite painful thing to do. So sometimes we can't be happy. Sometimes the circumstances of our life doesn't allow us to be happy, and we shouldn't be happy. And the other question is, what do we do with those people who are negative? What if they are not healthy and they're toxic? We call them toxic. What do we do with them? Do we exterminate them because they're not right kind of people? They don't fit into the world of healthy, happy people. So it's quite problematic. Psychological type of society, therapeutic society, for various reasons. It's hard to say. Well, it's also problematic if a previous type of human was better, moral human or religious human. But this one is also not perfect. Maybe it solves some problem of oppressive society that was before in traditional order of things, but it has its own problem, and it's oppressive in its own unique way. So now to therapeutic education, and I was partially right, because most of you were mentioning words from psychology. If we think about education, because we are psychological people, we think in terms of psychology. For example, we are too stressed. Except for many of you wrote that there are too many readings. Sorry, concrete problem. Or someone mentioned boredom. Boredom is quite actually not psychological, but more even philosophical. But we can use it in both contexts, in psychology and in philosophy, in a different ways. In philosophy, it's used in a more interesting, better way. But still, most of the sticky notes there are about psychology. Some of them are also about something being unfair education, existing within unfair society. That's the next stage we're going to talk about. So this is just experiment to show you that we are psychological humans, and our education, the way we think about it is, if you reflect critically on it, we'll see that it's also therapeutic. So education that exists within therapeutic society can only be therapeutic, right? If you think about ourselves, our relationship with others, in terms of psychology, we also think about our learning process, about our relationship with peers and relationship with professors in psychological terms. And we do. I used to be part of TC, and I remember what kind of complaints students normally do. They are psychological mostly. Yeah, therapeutic education. And one of the main people who started to talk about therapeutic education following Philip brief perspective on therapeutic society is Rice. He claimed in his work, The Therapeutic School, that education is not anymore what it used to be. It's not about instruction anymore, or not about passing knowledge. In its essence, it has become a group therapy. So it's also turning into the therapeutic mechanism. If before the goal of traditional education was to pass knowledge, and this is what was initially called education, now it's not education anymore, or it's not so much about passing knowledge, but it's starting to be more about group therapy. Maybe not in Russia, but still in Russia, we have this ideal that this is how good education, especially at the SAES, that shouldn't be stressful, that teachers, professors supposed to function also as a therapist, and our parents supposed to function as a therapist. All the people ideally supposed to function as a therapist. And the problem is that within such setting, it's problematic to for education understood as a passing of knowledge to function properly. And therefore, Rice claimed that this produces the culture of egocentrism and narcissism when students think about how they feel, whether they're stressed, whether their professors are toxic, some of them are especially toxic, and it's more self-reflective. It's not about, we'll talk about a little bit later, traditional education. No one ever thought if a professor is toxic. He was toxic, but by definition. So physical violence was a part even of education. If you are not beaten, you are lucky. That's all that's all you get. And now suddenly someone is toxic because they don't take care, don't provide enough emotional care for you. That makes them toxic. So teacher, according to Rice critique, whose critique is based on Reef critiques, teachers now have to function as psychotherapists. This is a part of their profession. It's not only about passing knowledge anymore. To be professional, you also need to be a psychotherapist and attend to emotional needs of students. The other researchers here are Ecclestone and Heiss. This is one of your readings. We'll discuss it on the seminars in more detail. They claim something similar, that learning has become almost anything but not learning in a meaningful, not education in a sense that it was initially implied. The problem is that it's this psychological perspective, according to them, degrades human dignity, because students are perceived and children are perceived as someone who are suffering, someone who not supposed to suffer, someone who's supposed to be happy, nurtured, not traumatized, not stressed. We need to provide first for children a happy childhood. And if you fail, you're a bad parent, you're bad teacher, suddenly. And this degrades human dignity, because we see those who we teach and those who are supposed to be taught as a fragile, suffering, and at the same time, it's our fault, they're not supposed to suffer. It's our non-professionalism. And the only question that remains, that is the most important question: are the children happy? Are they happy or they're not? It's not about knowledge anymore. It's not about skills anymore that much, but it's mostly about the emotional needs of those who participate in the process. So again, education turns into a psychotherapeutic group instead of remaining within the setting of education. Not to say that the initial setting of education was good, although they imply that it was good. No, they don't. They claim that they don't, but they do. They don't want to. So the problem here with all of this critique of therapeutic education is that it starts with Rice, Philippe Rice, who is rather a conservative. So his mood is nostalgic. It looks like he wants to come back to those moral people who were heroes, who were not weaklings, suffering, thinking, doing something great instead of going to psychotherapy, complaining how hard their life is, like who cares. So he was conservative, and this critique based on him is also quite a conservative, because they implied that it used to be model education that was a proper model of education, that it was about passing the knowledge and it worked well, and now something went wrong. Conservatism is dangerous because it implies that going back to some old models will bring the problem that those models had, like hierarchy, again, physical violence. We don't want it anymore, although it worked well, better than now in education. So meaning worked well in terms of knowledge, passing knowledge. So this is problem. This critique of therapeutic society and therapeutic education is problematic because it's quite conservative, even though it raises interesting questions of what is wrong with the therapeutic education, therapeutic society. And it's important to write those questions because now, as psychological humans, we don't see problems in the psychological perception of ourselves. We don't see, it's hard for us to critically analyze it. We see it as absolute good, as absolute ideal, therapeutic ideal, that we shouldn't suffer. There's supposed to be someone who is taking care of us, and someone who knows what is the healthy type of learning, what is the healthy type of relationship. But when we don't doubt this ideal, it's quite dangerous, because there might be people who are imposing a certain type of human that might be serve weird needs or might be not possible to implement. And this turns our life into gulag, because we think that there is this healthy, happy learning, happy, healthy student, but we are not them, a happy, healthy professor, but I'm not her. And meaning something is wrong with me, I have to work on myself. So it's also problematic in different ways. But yeah, so before, just to summarize, maybe before traditional education, and as you know, it appeared within the religious system of church schools. So initially the idea was that there is the scope of knowledge, including moral knowledge, and first of all, moral knowledge, transcendental knowledge, religious knowledge back then to universities, and the idea was to transfer it. The student was perceived as a passive, someone recipient of correct knowledge who has to be filled with the proper knowledge, and also installation of moral values and religious dogmas. This is the setting, the setting where university appears. It is religious setting. And of course, there is this strict hierarchy of professors and of students. Students have to listen, professors have to talk. Students have to talk only if teachers will need to check their knowledge. So the strict hierarchy. Now it changes. Now it transforms the modern education, secular education, and progress with university is associated mostly with secularization. When university liberates itself from religious influence from church, it's not religious anymore, maybe not to that extent. So there is still knowledge transfer, but it's secular knowledge, and there is, I mean, more generally, it's about intellectual development of a person, and the accent would be switched now to more holistic development, and this holistic development includes psychological well-being, emotional intelligence, social skills. So after the therapeutic turn in education, and this is the education after therapeutic turn, everything changes, and the aspect of emotional, psychological well-being and emotional intelligence become primal, slowly, aspect of learning and education. Because we don't believe in transcendental values anymore, with a decline of religious worldview, and kind of trying to find the instance which we can develop, which can help us to exist within society. So we're working on ourselves. If there is no God anymore, no transcendental values anymore, what remains is ourselves. We can work with ourselves, with our own psychological abilities, and try to establish a society, non-hierarchical society, relying on ourselves first of all. So the problem with this critique of therapeutic society and therapeutic education is that it's conservative. It implies that it used to be better. Now it's something went wrong because of this accent on psychological, on psychology. The better maybe way to criticize it, although similar way, but not that much, not nostalgic, is Foucault way, using his concept of pastoral power. Alenka Zupancic was talking about biopower. It's also similar to Foucault concept about the taking care of bodies, but Foucault has different concept, is pastoral, concept of a pastoral power, and he claims that it used to be within moral traditional society, the type of power that he called sovereign power, with the king or some tyrannic authority who imposes their own rules, or church. Now, in democratic societies, we have what Foucault called pastoral power. It's power of caring. It's also oppressive in its own way, but it's less oppressive. And because it's less oppressive, it might be even more dangerous. So contrary to sovereign power, pastoral power is power that cares, power that aims at well-being. So it's not a king anymore, or not the church authority who will tell you that you're sinful or you did something wrong and it will punish you for this. There is no this instance of knowledge, no instance of authority that will tell you what to do. Now there are experts, psychologists mostly, who will care of you, and by this taking care, like Christian pastors used to take care of their flock and directing them towards certain way of life, non-sinful way of life. And they were those who knew what is proper, non-sinful and moral way of life is. This includes patriarchy, for example. They were those who are taking care of your soul, helping it to be not sinful, directing you to heaven, to salvation. Now we have a similar structure, but this instance of care, instance of pastoral power are psychological. For Foucault, it's more in a more broad way, it's medical power, but it includes psychologists, it includes all kind of experts that help us care for us. So now you have to do something because it's good for you, you will be claimed, because it's for your own well-being. And before, the rules of your life were imposed under the pretext that it's good for your soul. You have to obey men, right, to get salvation. We take care of your female soul, imposing certain rules of you because we care for your soul. Now it's different, but it's still care, it's still imposition of certain rules. When these rules come from the medical authority, science authority, and it takes care of psychological health, not the soul anymore. But it's still oppressive because it's still imposition of a certain ideal type of human being, the type of human being who is not suffering, who is happy. And we'll later see what are some of the problems with it, except for the problems that we already mentioned. And the main problem is that those people who know what's proper relationship between human and proper human supposed to look like, it's dangerous that someone knows, because no one knows, and there is such ideal doesn't actually exist. But those people are those who guide you, and this need of someone who will guide us, someone who will tell us what to do, is dangerous in itself. So Foucault is better in this way, in his criticism, because he doesn't imply that it was better before. What he implies that it's what we have now, the psychological, the pastoral power, something similar to Therapeutic Society. But for Foucault, it's not worse than it just transformation of a same, but in a new guise, in a new wrapper. There are still oppressive roots in something that we consider democratic. It's something we consider good and non-oppressive. And this makes it even more oppressive in a way, because this power is more dispersed and we think that it's for our own good. And just in case, there is no escape from it. It's not that he's offering something. Foucault is very pessimistic in this way. And he doesn't offer any salvation anymore, any way where we can transform it. Neither we have to go back to previous models, neither we have to go somewhere else to idealize future models. This is what it is. We need care to survive. We need to care about each other, and others need to take care of us, but this is the only type of care that we know. And it's problematic and oppressive. So Foucault claimed that he didn't like psychoanalysis that much, and he claimed that he saw a figure of psychoanalyst, figure of Freud as the pastor. Because pastor, before, if you go to confess, it looks like it helps you with your salvation, right? Because you'll tell the pastor about your sins, and pastor will forgive you or will give you some advice. But it is care for your soul, but at the same time, this is the instance who you confess to. This is the instance who you're opening yourself, who you trust. This is the instance of authority. So this help is authoritative help. And similar is with psychoanalysts for Foucault. They also work as pastors. You don't confess, you do confess psychotherapeutic, psychoanalytic sessions. So you also open up, and the psychoanalyst is the instant of authority who can interpret what is happening with you and kind of guide you somewhere. Plus, you pay money for this. So it's maybe improvement because it's not direct, authoritative, like not that directly authoritative like it was with pastors, but it's still the instance of authority. And if we talk about education, so Emil Bjergsen claims that this is the Innovative Modern Learning Environments program in Great Britain that he criticizes. It implied the accent on the emotional well-being of students, and it also implied that they're supposed to be curators of something or individual track of learning. So he claims that it's still a pastoral power. It's still pastoral education, just in a new guise. It's still what Foucault claims to be pastoral education. So those psychologists who are teachers and who are the qualification of psychologists that we want to add to qualification of a teacher, and pretending and claiming that it's improvement and it's something progressive is, on the contrary, might be just the repetition of pastoral methods of education. It used to be pastor who told you what to do, how to behave, good manners, Sunday church, school at church. And now what is claimed therapeutic school education is just and something that looks progressive, might be just a step back to the, but under the different, in a different guise. So the progressive might be, within perspective of Foucault, is this old oppressive methods. The other thing is that the problem with contemporary psychology and with the therapeutic education, that there are different types of psychology, and I'm probably a psychologist too, and but the problem with the therapeutic education is that there is a certain kind of psychology, a certain kind of understanding of human being that is at the basis, that become the core of this therapeutic turn. And it's not that much psychoanalysis. We wouldn't see psychoanalytic view as something that defines that much how people think about themselves, maybe to a certain extent, but mostly the dominant one are humanistic and positive psychology, associated with Maslow, Rogers, and Seligman. And those are the ones that concentrate on individual well-being, self-actualization, and especially positive psychology has this emphasis on happiness, well-being, and positivity. This is like our contemporary unconscious, this kind of psychology, or pop psychology, a common sense of today is this type of psychology. This is something that we think without, this is something that we use in our everyday life, in our evaluation of who we are and of how things supposed to be, this kind of psychologies. But critical theory, if we discuss the criticism of this kind of psychology, critical theorists, for example, Herbert Marcuse and Theodor Adorno, they were the ones who already started to criticize those types of psychologies of capitalist society. And their main critique was that Adorno claimed that all psychotherapy is promoted to be objectively untrue and therapies are frauds. So, and the problem for them, the problem was with this kind of positive humanistic psychology that is concentrating on the individual and their personal individual well-being, is that they try to make subject happy they try to make the subject individual satisfied, healthy, but the problem is that they do it within unhealthy, what Marcuse and Adorno claim to be unhealthy, unjust society. And they kind of internalize social problem, and they blame subject for being unhealthy and claim that they need to work on themselves or work with psychologists for money to become happier. Like it's their own problem. This kind of psychology, individualistic psychology, it only see the problem. It blames the subject for the suffering, for mental suffering, that external circumstances, the reason for which are external circumstances, like the unjust order, unjust working conditions, or unjust treatment, or patriarchal order. So the problem with individualistic psychology, that it doesn't see unjust society, but it only sees the subject as unhappy, and concentrates on the subject, trying to make them happy and blaming them that they have to work on themselves to become happier and healthier. But by doing this, they kind of they deprive a subject of revolutionary spirit, and they deprive a subject of feeling of revolutionary possibility to form revolutionary community, and they direct them inwards, and society stays unjust, but those concrete subjects are adjust to the unjust society, and society stays unjust, but subjects are adapted to this society. For example, with patriarchal order, the order would stay patriarchal, but the woman will get adopted and happy within this unjust way of existence, or unfair work conditions or something. You just work on yourself without revolutionizing something, and in this way, being cured, psychologically cured in this society, just means to keep this society not changing anything outside of the subject. And the other thing is for Adorno, he criticizes it. They criticize any type of practical psychology, including practical psychoanalysis. They claim that this is exploitation, because plus the suffering subject needs to pay money for to talk about their suffering, and they would be blamed that this is their fault. This is not the system fault, it's their fault. They need to work on themselves, and they need to pay to get this valuable insight. Herbert Marcuse claimed that talk about the happy consciousness for them, the triumph of happy consciousness is the triumph of sleeping consciousness. Happy consciousness is the one that is sleeping, and it's not able to recognize there are some troubles and unjust order that if it would recognize, it wouldn't be happy anymore. So this is the way they see psychology, this humanistic individual psychology, what they call conformist psychology, as a way of sustaining unjust capitalist order of things. This is their criticism. And as education, as a part of this system, so education is also part of this unjust society and part of the therapeutic society. Therefore, the problem with education, according to this paper, Sarah Amster, that it's also one of your seminar readings, and we'll discuss it in more details. Education is central to the system of sustaining the unjust order of things, because the education exists within this society, and unfair society, and it exists within the therapeutic society. So education functions in such a way as same as the apparatus of psychology. It functions to adapt students to a future life in the unjust society. It would prepare you to your careers in the unjust world. It will prepare you psychologically to be adapted, not to be revolutionary subjects who are changing something. And it redirects the dissatisfaction of the unjust from the unjust society into the inwards, you supposedly need to work on yourself. So it doesn't change. Education is not this kind of traditional education. It's not the way to change society, to transform society, but to adapt to existing unjust society. According to Amsler and the critical theorist in Frankfurt School as such, it promotes this competitive individualism. Everyone is for themselves, and the other is the enemy. The other is a rival to, each one is a rival to. It's something we see here when you compete for good grades. It prepares you for future life when you complete. So the other is a rival, and it something that is contrary to the spirit of kind of community, when you support each other and help each other and collaborate with each other. Instead, the other is the one who can get better grades, therefore you will get worse grades, and there's this hierarchy of who is better. So this is problematic. It is what Amsler called a pedagogy of comfort, and she calls to establish, not her, but critical theory in general calls to establish the pedagogy of discomfort. So something that will admit the discomfort, not be comfortable with existing order, won't be something that is adapting to it, but rather changing it, feeling this discomfort and acting in a revolutionary way. The other thing is that what is critical pedagogy? Critical pedagogy, and we'll talk about it later in 1 week in more details. Critical pedagogy is something that opposed to the traditional pedagogy, and the person who come up with the term, who started to write about it, was Paulo Freire. It's a part of a larger scope of critical theory, probably familiar with it already. So he claimed that there is no such thing as neutral education. Education is can be something that functions either to bring comfort, to adapt, or to extend the existing ideology, to promote it, to sustain it, or to emancipate subject from it and bring freedom. And Freire was the one who started to talk about education in terms of colonization, those who are colonizing and those who are colonized. Students, of course, are colonized, and those who teach are those who colonize them. He coined the term banking approach to describe traditional education. Banking means education. Students are perceived as piggy banks, as someone passive recipient of knowledge, in whom you need to invest correct knowledge as a way of investment, to colonize their brain, to impose the correct way of understanding the world. This is the traditional education. And what the critical pedagogy ideally is supposed to look like, the opposite type of education is, let's see. Critical pedagogy, ideally, it does not adapt learners to the existing social order because it's unjust ideology, but it rather transforms the participants into someone who will be able to cooperate with others, and those will be actively pro-social and aimed at emancipation of society and eradication of elements of oppression and social injustice. So it's critical pedagogy and critical therapy, they don't like, obviously. For this precise reason, they don't like psychology, because psychology doesn't allow to be critical. The other problem is that it's good to talk about the critical pedagogy, but the problem is, according to Katie Wright, and I agree with her, that we are so psychological that it's impossible for us not to think in not psychological terms. We might start to think in moral terms, like make step back, but it's even worse with all the injustice that it brings and all the ideology that it brings. So we are kind of stuck in being psychological. But Katie Wright claims that since we're stuck in being psychological, since we're stuck in our education to be psychological, at least we can change maybe this psychology. We can keep being psychological humans, therapeutic humans, thinking that in terms of therapy and psychology, but maybe we can change the type of psychology that is at the basis of our thinking and make it more compatible with the critical theory. So like she's asking, as my question too, is it possible to combine, instead of just criticizing instead of criticizing therapeutic education, therapeutic society, and promoting critical theory, critical education, is it possible to combine them? And apparently it might be possible. It might be possible to do the critical turn in therapeutic education. Katie Wright and Sarah Amster, they claim that not all the aspects of psychological education, of psychological society, contradict critical theory and critical pedagogy, because there are some accents in education that are closely related to the ideals of justice. For example, within the psychological education, for example, when we learn to understand ourselves deeper, we also learn to be more empathic to others, to understand others better, to tolerate, maybe not tolerate, but be more inclusive, be less biased, be more empathic to others. So it not necessarily contradicts the idea of justice. It's also contribute in some aspects to the idea of equality and inclusiveness and empathy. And so to do this critical turn in therapeutic education, according to Katie Wright, we just need to concentrate in some aspects of psychological education that does not contradict the ideal of critical pedagogy and work on them. And also Sarah Amster points that within critical theory is also talk and develop a certain ideal type of a critical human, and it's also psychological type. Like you need to be to feel empathy to others. You need to be pro-social. You need to develop this pro-social sensibility and not to be egoistic, and learn how to work, how to connect, cooperate with others. So critical pedagogy is also in a way psychological pedagogy, just a different psychology at its core, not narcissistic, individualistic, and supporting the unjust order, but it's also psychological, also implies certain psychological qualities, but maybe they're psychological, but still different from what Reef and other critics of psychological therapeutic turns were talking about. And yeah, the last thing, we'll discuss it in more detail, this idea of critical turn in therapeutic, possible critical turn in therapeutic education during the next meeting. But just to think what kind of qualities, what this critical turn within therapeutic or within psychological education would look like, you might say that it would develop independent critical thinking and also emotional component of understanding and empathy. It would concentrate on the idea of mutual support, cooperation, and inclusiveness, and it will concentrate, in my view, this on awakening of happy consciousness from its sleep, meaning that it won't be happy consciousness anymore. And next time we will talk more, and maybe we'll discuss how this critical turn in therapeutic education might look like, considering that there is no way out from therapeutical turn. We can't just change ourselves and stop being therapeutical and psychological people. We are them, but we also want a just society, some of us at least, and how to combine those, meaning how to do the critical turn in therapeutic education. The other thing is that with critical theory, the problem with critical theory in general, not to idealize it, is that it's also therapeutic in a way that we might criticize, because it's also, or Foucault might criticize, because it also imposes a certain type of human, certain type of qualities that we need to have, and claiming that those are better than the capitalist kind of qualities, but they also work as those who Foucault called pastors. They also try to save society, save your soul. And when they talk about awakening of happy consciousness, meaning that happy consciousness is not going to be happy anymore, they only talk about it for, they only see the need for it only for a while, and then we're going to be happy again. So they also impose this ideal of happiness, but not individual happiness, collective happiness. And if you remember from existential perspective, it's impossible. So they're also pastors. That's the problem. And it might sound great, the critical theory, but it's also tricky in a way. There is some authority who is imposing a certain type of certain vision of society, certain vision of individual, and tries to save your soul or save someone. So this is tricky. And with university, it's also hard to say what to do, because university appears within the traditional order, especially within the order of as a part of the mechanism of church. It's hard to transform it into anything else. So wherever you transform it into, it still preserves some of the qualities of its initial oppressive structure. Like, it's still a professor who is talking, you are listening, and we still have, it's hard to make it equal and non-hierarchical. Still, the question if whether a university should exist at all in a society of the future, since they are the product of a traditional order. But for now, they do exist. And maybe, like Siavash was saying, maybe it's impossible to change it in such a way. Maybe you have to ruin the whole thing. Because the very thing, the very mechanism, this huge machine that exists, maybe it can only exist in such a way. And it's also, our brains are the product of this machine. So it's hard with using our brains to imagine something new, non-oppressive. Yeah, that's all. I think we can do Q&A for 20 minutes. Do you have questions? No? Yes.
Maybe I will misunderstood, but is all educations that we have today in the first century and all therapeutic? Is it like every